Good afternoon, and welcome to A Gathering Place, brought to you by the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce. I'm your host, Marilyn Hemingway, and today we're talking Black History Month. Why Black History Month and everything else connected to Black History Month for the next hour that we could think of, which means you need to drop your questions and comments in the comment section so we can answer your questions too, because we have with us special guest, Professor, author, and historian Damon Fordham, we're going to chat about Black History Month and anything else you want us to talk about. And we're going to start that right after this opening.
Hello, I'm Marilyn Hemingway, and welcome to A Gathering Place. I said, I'm stepping back because we have young voices who want to be heard and they're moving on something.
Branding is really important to you and your business.
Even a basic type of technology, you learn it all.
And people are
Good question.
Well, we're back, folks, and we're going to be talking Black History Month today with Damon Fordham, professor, author, and historian. Let's go ahead and bring Damon in. Damon, how are you doing?
Quite well, my dear fellow Gamecock and classmates.
I know, right? Go Cox. We've known each other for quite a while.
That's right.
Yeah, we're making Black history even as we speak, and I wanted to bring you on, Damon, just to talk about Black History Month. You know, you and I, just before we came on, we're talking about social media and things that we see out there, and one of the things I see out there is Black history. I see more and more Black history should be taught 365, 24/7, which I believe in. Mm-hmm. And I think I show that with my actions by bringing folks on, historians and others, to this show. But, you know, I also want to talk about the origins of Black History Month. Why Black History Month? Because we also talked about, unfortunately, younger generations who don't have a full picture of things. Let me put it, at best, I could put it that way. But let's talk about Black History Month. Why Black History Month and why it's so important, and why it's so important that we teach Black history 365, 24/7. So let's start at the beginning. Your thoughts regarding Black History Month.
Okay, first of all, I don't know if you remember a man named James Campbell who died about 2 years ago at the age of 95 here in Charleston. He was an esteemed scholar who worked with Malcolm X.
I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, back when President Obama was running in 2008, I was talking to him about how a lot of Black people were going around saying, excuse me, who the spook think he is by running for president and so forth. They just didn't have the vision to see the possibility of such a thing. And he told me that you have to remember that many of our people live in what he called a culture of despair, meaning that you had people who were so embittered and psychologically wounded by their experience during the segregation era and beyond, that their whole mentality toward life was negative with these broken spirits, you see. So therefore, they had this whole idea of pessimism and negativity when it came to things thus. Now, what does that have to do with Black History Month? Because so often I run into people who say this the street corner barbershop mythology that Black History Month was given to us because it was the shortest and coldest month. And many people really believe that. But the truth of the matter is that Black History Month was not given to us, quote unquote, at all. Here's the real story. You had a man named Dr. Carter G. Woodson from Kentucky. And Carter G. Woodson's uncle, as a matter of fact, ran away, basically beat up his master and ran away during slavery and was sold off because he had beaten up the slave owner. And so he grew up in the coal mines of Kentucky and somehow was able to go to first Berea College in Kentucky. And then on, he actually got a PhD from Harvard. I think he was the second Black person after W.E.B. Du Bois to do so. And he came to see that not that with all the negative misinformation about Black people in his day. He was born in 1875. He had to do something about that. So he had his PhD in history. So he started the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, then studied Negro history. And he started what was called Negro History Week in 1926. And the idea was that young children be aware of the contributions of Black people. Now, and it's had nothing to do with it being the shortest or coldest month. He did it to honor two people, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, okay, for very obvious reasons. If you know the story of how Frederick Douglass negotiated with Lincoln for our freedom, you know, that makes perfectly good sense. So it went off like that. Black history became a side thing, especially in the segregated Black schools of the South. You had teachers who would teach this type of thing on the side, where it couldn't be made officially part of the curriculum. They would bring in books by Dr. Carter G. Woodson and poetry by Langston Hughes and have them singing Lift Every Voice and Sing and so forth. And this is the kind of thing that psychologically and spiritually got the people over during the time that the rest of the world said that they were good at all things physical and nothing mental. And it's important to understand, they were taught that they were good at all things physical and nothing mental to keep them as a permanent class of cheap labor. It's important to understand that. And so this kind of went against that grain. Then in 1976, the decision was made with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History that this Negro History Week should be expanded into a whole month. And that's how Black History Month came into being.
You know, what you just said, I was very much aware of 98% of that. But as you were speaking, and I'm thinking of offshoots, how nuanced our history is. For example, I don't know if you saw a previous show, I had Dr. Derek Aldridge on, and we spoke about African American intellectual traditions. And he is a historian, African American at the University of Virginia. And originally from South Carolina, finished Winthrop. But he's a friend of mine. I brought him on. And you started out talking about the barbershop mythology. But in our discussion of the African American intellectual traditions, the barbershops and beauty salons are part of those African American intellectual traditions, as well as sitting under the tree talking, as well as those local historians. Most of the time, they're teachers who have retired and in their retirement have decided, I want to preserve the local history, and maybe I'll archive what I find in my home. And many times, and I've been in many little African Black museums across the South where a school teacher archived Black history, they died, and they left their home to the community so they could turn the home into a Black museum. And then, of course, you have the academics, the professors, the doctorates who are in history, or also our history teachers. Because you talked about the books beyond the books, the textbook. I just had a conversation this week with someone who was talking about, we were taught when they closed the book. I remember my teacher, in this case, it was Tommy Shubrick, Reverend Tommy Shubrick, who happened to be my mother's godson. But anyway, the person was telling me he closed the book and would teach us outside of the book. So that's a tradition too. And when I hear you talking, all these things came floating through my mind that touched on Black history and African Black intellect. All of that is intertwined because it took an intellect to start Negro History Week, and then it evolved into Black History Month. And you are very correct. No one gave it to us. We created it. Someone created it, which actually speaks to why we have these type of conversations you and I are having now, why we have this big argument about CRT, because they've whitewashed our history. They've even attempted, we don't realize if we don't have the knowledge and truly understand where things started, that's a whitewashing of our history that we have built into this mythology. No one gave us February as the shortest month for Black History Month. It was created so we can understand our history. And that too is evolving because now people are saying 365, 24/7, which it should be. It should be. So you started out, there's so many nuances to that. And of course, in my mind, the way I think, I love nuance. I love complexities. That's critical thinking, which is not reflected in this battle against CRT, but we're going to bring that up in the show too. But I just want to throw out that just what you just said, there are so many offshoots from what you just said, even though it was a straightforward history of why Black History Month was started.
Well, I mean, all of that is true. But now getting back to what you said about the barbershops and all of that, yes, it's true that people who are the age of you and myself grew up under these wise elders who lived through these type of things and were able to tell us these things. But unfortunately, I'll answer your question in just a moment. That's a good
we'll
question.
Get to that, Latasha. Good question.
Yeah, we're going to answer that in a minute. Now, but the problem with that is that, see, that's when you and I were young. That generation has largely passed away, who were these legitimate self-educated historians. And so therefore, the young people of today are not exposed to that kind of thing, unfortunately, because there are too many generations removed from that. So in times of crisis, false prophets do well. And you have these people who are on YouTube and the internet promoting a lot of negativity and misinformation, telling these young people this ridiculous things, such as that Harriet Tubman was a fictional character. There's one popular YouTube character that said, "Oh yes, there's one." Yes.
That's a new one to me. Oh my gosh!
That's why I pay attention to these things. And you have another one who's going around convincing these young people that we never lived in Africa, that we were here before the Native American Indians and all this, and that this stuff about Africa was designed to keep our minds in bondage. See, in times of crisis, false prophets do well. And the problem is that, see, these type of individuals who put out this junk aim themselves primarily at the street corner crowd. And oftentimes people who know the real history aren't aware of these type of characters until they develop a prominent following. So that's why people who know these things have to pay attention to what's happening in the man in the street, so we'll know how to combat that sort of thing.
I agree with you. So, and then some of it is ingrained with a little bit of truth, and then they twist it. For example, the one with the Native Americans, I didn't hear that directly, but it is true that there's been studies, archaeologists, anthropologists, which, by the way, we need more Black anthropologists and archaeologists, that there was, for example, we keep hearing 1619 as
1526.
1526, but to clarify that, though, people have to understand 1619 was the first recorded
and permanent.
Thank you. Permanent appearance of enslaved Africans. 1526 in Georgetown, the first enslaved Africans stepped foot in Georgetown, and it is believed that a great many of them escaped into the forest, the woods,
that is true,
and the wetlands. It's true. Then the Spanish, because it was a Spanish ship too.
Juan Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón.
Yeah, then they went down the coast and then became more permanent. And we know that now has St. Augustine, Florida.
That's
and
right.
American Beach and all of that. But the first step was in Georgetown County, South Carolina in 1526. So I think people, the charlatans, for lack of a better term, they take bits and pieces of what they hear and then they twist it into something that's not true.
But that's how most charlatans work. I mean, if they'd said things that were just completely ridiculous nonsense, no one would listen to them. So you have to plant a little bit of the truth. You have to put a little bit of the junk with the foolishness the facts, a little bit of facts with the foolishness in order to hook people into it. You see, that's how propaganda works. And it's important for people who try to combat that sort of thing to understand that. But you see, this is where you have to understand, and I was talking about this with David Mack on his radio show yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
This is where you have to understand both the book knowledge and the people knowledge in order to fuse these things together. Because in 1964, the great Sam Cooke, who was probably the most intellectual of the rhythm and blues singers of his time, Dick Clark was interviewing him on American Bandstand that year. You can see this on YouTube. And he asked Sam what was the secret to his success and his ability to write songs that got to the heart of the people. And he said, Dick, the simple answer is this: observation. So if you study a lot, but don't observe the average Jane and the average Joe, you're just only halfway there, you see. And so that's why it's important that you understand what's happening with the common people as well as what's happening with the book in order for this to work. Now, I'm going to give you a good quick case of that. Some years ago, I was teaching Lies My Teacher Told Me by John Lowen.
Love that book. Go ahead.
But there's a part of that book where he said that the system was so rigged that it was almost impossible for Black people to rise out of poverty and succeed. Now, I had a class at that time filled with working class African-American women. And they're like, well, Professor Fordham, if that's true, why are we even here in school to begin with?
Mm-hmm.
So I took the book, went to the trash can. We're not using this again. Because you see, yeah, exactly. Because if you look at it from a leftist and Marxist perspective, I mean, there may be something to that. But that's not the kind of thing you want to put in the heads of Black people who are trying to get somewhere in society to begin with, you see. So that's why you have to use people sense along with the book sense in order to get anywhere.
So I like that book. I do. But I also, as I was listening to you,
critical thinking,
but also diverse sources, multiple sources. Because not only do I like that book, but critical thinking means you can discern and filter out what is useful, what is accurate to your circumstance. For example, The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn is another good book, but it's not the totality. Because even since then, 1619 is, another example. It's additional information regarding the totality of our history. It's not the totality. It's moving us all in the direction so that we have a holistic view of our history.
I agree with that. Now, I think I should clarify something to you. Now, when I threw that book in the trash can in front of the class, I was not saying that this book is junk, don't read it at all. But for the purposes of that class, this was not good.
Gotcha.
Now, having said that, I think that when you get to a certain level in your development and education, you can understand how you can look at a book like that and take what is good and reject what is bad in it, you see. But you have to get people to a certain point in that before they understand that. Because, it's like years ago, this rapper named Shinehead, back in the 80s, he did a lyric, and I can't remember the song, that kind of sums it up where a lot of people are right now, where he talked about all you so-called righteous rappers acting like a sacred cow. You read one book and you know it all now. You see, and now what often happens is a person would take a book and they figure, okay, well, this is the end of it. Takes years to get to a point where you understand that when you read a book, you have to discern from what is accurate to your situation and what you could take with you, you see. Or as Mencius, the Chinese philosopher, once said, a person who only knows what is in books is better off not reading.
I think that's what people don't understand about higher education.
Exactly.
Because I just saw a meme on Facebook yesterday. I didn't save it.
Hate those things.
Yeah. And it was so simplistic and it was negative towards college. And it was saying, I'm going to paraphrase because I can't, but it was basically saying like college didn't teach you plumbing. It didn't, you can't fix your plumbing because that's not what you learned in college. And I'm really bastardizing it, but it was like,
I know what you're talking about.
They were implying that college wasn't worthy because it doesn't teach you.
Waste of time, right?
Yeah, or those who say, why do we not learn algebra when we need to learn personal finance.
It goes back.
Let me say this though, before you say that. I am of the school that we can learn both, okay? This is not an either or question, folks, but it's we don't realize that propaganda sneaks into our minds. And now you hear more Black folks talking about, they're like derogatory towards college or backhanded compliments or don't go to four-year school, go to tech school because you make more money and this and that. But you could do both, people. You could do both. I remember coming up, my dad was business manager at Horry Georgetown Technical College, Georgetown campus. And back then, the push was military, 2-year school, go to 2-year school first if you're not sure. Then if you're sure, get that degree, then you have options. That 2-year degree, you have options. Then if you want to go get your 4-year degree. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't like go to 4-year, never go to 2-year. It was presented as options. We don't realize how propaganda sneaks into our head. And I hear more people, you don't want that debt. You don't go to 4-year school because you don't want that debt. Become a plumber, you can make more money. You do not have to denigrate 4-year schools to uplift a plumbing degree or an electrician degree or all those vocational options, people. It's about options. But go ahead, Damon, what you were saying. Go ahead.
What you're saying requires, hello, Ms. Richards. What you're saying requires two things that you talked about a little bit earlier, which is context and nuance. And unfortunately, a lot of young people today are not exposed to the concepts of context and nuance. And in other words, balancing this information out to understand that this is not absolute. Not one size does not fit all, okay? Now, you and myself were both exposed when we were at the University of South Carolina to a lot of ideas that expanded our way of thinking and helped us to get to a point away from being absolute in our thinking to issues of nuance and context. A lot of young people today don't grow up in the type of homes that teach that kind of thing, you see. And that's true not just with Black youth, but as we see by the people who respond to the last presidential administration, that's kind of across the board in these United States. So there's some people out there who, because what was the guy's name? Gardner with the several schools of intelligence, where he was a professor out of Harvard in the 80s that said that there was just not one school form of intelligence, which is book learning, but you have several other types of Howard Gardner.
Yeah.
Several different schools of intelligence where some people have this brilliance at body skills, some have skills at fixing skills, some people have skills at musical talent, etc. So we all
emotional intelligence,
right? Howard Gardner, yes, all of that. See, and that idea didn't come out until 1983, and up to that point, people figured that if you weren't book smart, you were dumb. And Howard Gardner helped to evolve that idea into understanding that each of us are intelligent, but only at different things. So, in other words, one size does not fit all. Technical school is great for people who are good with their hands and who enjoy that sort of thing. People like you and me who like to read books and are into ideas and all of that. Liberal arts is good for people like us, to where both of us are now, you and I as individuals, enjoy what we're doing and so forth. So it's about getting away from the one size fits all approach into understanding that each person should be free to develop their own interests and gifts and move accordingly.
Exactly. And ironically, because of segregation, many Black schools graduated into academic intellectuals coming out of schools that were designed to create service workers, laborers, because they had no choice. But they ended up still going to college and becoming academic intellectuals. Hence the traditions of calling people professor when they were high school teachers or middle school teachers, because it was an honor title. It was a title of honor, but also to recognize your academic academic intellectualism. So we were forced into that situation with it wasn't a formal codified type thing in a sense that was written down. It was written down in the sense that schools separate but equal, but it wasn't, someone did say all the blacks gonna go into one school and they're gonna go on to college. This group is gonna go to college. This is just gonna, be labor. This is gonna go into the military. They dumped us all into one school.
Right.
And we were all taught by these same people who had this education level. So it actually, in a sense, benefited us in many ways. Now, I'm not saying that because we also have people say integration hurt us. That's a whole nother conversation. So my argument when we say, and with my maturity and more knowledge, I'm going to say integration didn't hurt us, nor did it help us, because I don't think in America we've ever truly integrated our public school system. You first have to have true integration. Then you can step back and say, we truly integrated. And now we can look at it and say, did it hurt us and did it help us? But I think in America, we've never truly integrated. And what do I mean by that? We've been in segregated school systems much longer than integrated school systems. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education said to basically integrate with haste, and I'm paraphrasing,
all deliberate speed.
Yeah, with all deliberate speed. Thank you. I couldn't remember what it was. With all deliberate speed. When there were still some schools in the 1980s and 90s still segregated in pockets across this country, and were forced to integrate, so it's, and in schools that actually shut down, like in Virginia, they actually shut down their public school system.
Prince Edward County,
But
1964.
to prevent integration. And all this stuff had to be corrected over time.
Mm-hmm.
As a nation, I don't think we had busing situations in the North. Yeah, that was a fight over integration. That was a huge, huge fight. So I don't think America and now we're going backwards in many ways because social economics are determining racial segregation. So it's like you're going to live in what's perceived as the better school districts. Because you want to raise your children in that. Black people want to raise their children in better school districts too. So I think segregation is more social economic driven now, but the result is racial segregation. America, I really think the more accurate argument is America has never truly integrated their public school system.
Well, let me say this to that.
Go ahead, but that's obviously my opinion. Go ahead. This is why we're having this discussion.
All right. Well, I think it depended. Eric, that is absolutely correct. Critical thinking skills are essential no matter.
Exactly.
Very good. Very good. But here's the thing about that. Integration, as we know it, was beneficial for some, but some people thrive from it. Because in my situation, I was attending a segregated elementary school in 1970. And my dad, that's true, the denial of resources. We'll get to that in a minute. But in 1970, my dad came to pick me up at the segregated school where in those days, the segregated schools had split sessions, meaning that some students went in the morning and some went in the afternoon. So my dad went to pick me up one day and I was reading the Golden Dictionary, a classic children's book, right? And the teacher was with the other students. So my dad asked the teacher, is he being punished? And the teacher said, no, sir, Mr. Fordham. And so said, well, why is he over there with himself while the other children are reading this book? And the teacher told my dad, well, Mr. Fordham, your son already knows how to read and write, so we can't do anything with him here. That's how I wound up going to the integrated school. So at 1979, when I went to Wando High School, I was reunited with the kids that I was at the segregated elementary school with, because it was a feeder school to what would become Wando High School. And the vast majority of the students who were at the segregated school were reading way below grade level and taking the most basic courses. Now, of course, at that time, I couldn't articulate it. But what you essentially had going on was that the whole system of segregation to begin with, in 1895, when Benjamin Tillman advocated for the segregation of all of that, was to establish a permanent class of cheap labor. It's important to understand that. Mm-hmm. And the best of our teachers tried to do what they can to overcome that by teaching beyond what was required of them. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case with everybody, you see. So these type of things have to be taken into consideration, in that it's not that you have all this nonsense where I hear people talk about learning styles of Black children as if all Black children learn alike or anything like that.
I know.
Oh, I had to curse one out over that one time. But what you had happen was, this was the circumstance that these people were placed in for generations. Esau Jenkins, the great Black leader of Charleston. I have an interview at my house that he did July 28th, 1968 in the Charleston News and Courier, where he was a boy on Johns Island in the 1910s when he was at a friend's house, and before he went to school that day, he stopped by there to say hello to his friends, and a white grower came by the lady's house and said, "Well, look here, Emma, I need your boys to come help me pick my beans today." And the lady let the children go. And he saw, even as a young person, that this type of thing is what was crippling his community. And even though Esau Jenkins himself only had a 4th grade education, he managed to study with local ministers and people like Septima Clark, to where he managed to own businesses from Charleston up to Atlantic Beach throughout up until his death in 1972. So all of that goes to show that the people were victims of circumstance in this, and they have to understand that it was not that they were psychologically fit for all things physical and not things mental. They were put in that circumstance, and we need to study, and those of us who know the teachings of our greats who overcame that have to bring those teachings to the average Jane and the average Joe so they can overcome.
And it also, Esau Jenkins' story shows just because you don't have academic credentials does not mean you're not an intellect. He was very much an intellect because he had the intellect means you have the capability of learning. That's it. That is it. That's it. Whether it's book learning or people learning or observation learning, that's what intellect is. You don't need credentials to be an intellect.
Well, that's true. So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's true, because if you look at all the great philosophers of the ancient world that we read today, going back to the great Egyptian philosopher Ptahhotep, who was 2,300 years before Socrates, and Socrates himself, as well as Confucius and all the others, these were people who were just simply well-read observers of human behavior and nature, and their teachings still affect people today, because while the styles of things change and various social things change, human nature is basically the same as it was 2,000 years ago when these people walked the earth. Now, my own grandmother, Janie Fordham, out of Awendaw, South Carolina, never went to school a day in her life, never learned how to read and write, spoke Geechee till the day she died. In 1973 or 4, when I was going to the integrated school and all that, I would come back to my grandmother's house and I would put down my books, and she said, "Boy, go ahead and read me something out of them books." And I'm like, "Grandma, why do you want me to?" She goes, "Boy, just read out of them books to me." And I would read to her my story books and my English books and things like that. And she would sit in her rocking chair and react with such joy to hear me do this. Now, at the age of 8 and 9, of course, I had no idea why she was making me do this. But today, because I didn't know until long after she was dead that she was illiterate. But when I understand that now, that was her way of knowing that I would wind up in a different path than her, and that I would continue the advancement that began when she saved her money to send my dad to South Carolina State back in the 40s, you see. So I say all that to say is that there's a difference between being illiterate and being ignorant. They are not one and the same. Being illiterate means you may lack the tools to read and write. It doesn't mean that you are stupid, okay? It just means that you just don't know how to read and write.
That's right. That's right. But when you manipulate history, that's why it's so important to understand the holistic approach to history. It's been manipulated that you're not smart because you can't read or write. And we don't realize that literally was put in the law because they knew how powerful education was, that they actually created laws denying us the right to learn how to read and write. But that's to learn, read, and write English. Let's talk about our traditions, our oral traditions of teaching and learning from each other. You know, when we came over, I've in the last few years since I started the Gullah Geechee Chamber, I make a point of saying our enslaved ancestors were brought over because of their knowledge of how to control the water and manage the land. Because usually you see the pictures, we're in the field, you know, they say, oh, we just grew the rice, we picked the rice, and kind of stop there. Our ancestors were brought here because their knowledge of how to control the water, the trunk system, digging the canals, manage the land to grow the rice. They understood the tidal systems. They understood the difference between fresh and salt water. All of this system that their free labor and free mental intellect created was just as important to understand the physical as it is to understand the mental knowledge that they had that was the underpinning for this entire agricultural system. The Europeans did not know how to grow rice. They recognized the land when they came over here and made some connections. They didn't know how to do indigo. They didn't know how to do rice and sugar and all of that, but we did, and we orally passed it down. No one went to the publisher and printed a book and said, now learn how to be, you know, how to grow rice. You did it by observation, and you did it by actually doing it, by practical hands-on application. And that was passed on by tradition, generation to generation. We've been disconnected from that. But the lesson in there and understanding, if we learned it orally, if our ancestors learned it orally and by doing, we can still learn that again and have that understanding. You know, so that goes into all my things I'm working on with the Gullah Geechee Seafood Trail and all of that too. That's a deeper conversation, but it speaks to understanding our history impacts our future. It gives us that pride that we didn't specifically say pride, but the pride in understanding the strength it took to survive the peculiar institution of slavery, the seeds that were planted that allow you and I to have this conversation right now, the seeds that were planted that allow the folks viewing this show to understand what we're saying and to ask the questions that they're asking. Someone stood in a house. Someone stood in the field within the peculiar institution of slavery and dreamt a dream that for future generations we would be free and have options and opportunities that they would not have. Those are the seeds that they planted. That was the intellect that they understood, that they put in songs. You know, they put into action, into revolt. Many times not necessary for their freedom, because they knew if we revolted, we face death. If we were caught, we're going to die. This isn't freedom for me. This me pushing my child or grandchild to read is not necessarily the benefit of me. It's going to be the future generations that I'm planting those seeds for. And that's why it's so important that we understand and learn Black history. That's what's building in us. It's in us. Our ancestors are always speaking to us and they're in us. I want to get some of the questions. Go ahead while you're going, because there's some questions we have here, and we said we were going to answer them.
Well,
so
it's important to say this about that, okay?
Go ahead.
You see, the West Africans, with the part of Africa where we came from, were largely what were known before the Muslims came there in 1076 and converted many of them to the Islamic faith, where you had to learn to read Arabic and write Arabic to understand the Quran and become a Muslim. Our societies were oral societies. You had these people called griots that would pass down information of kings, queens, families, etc., and so forth by word of mouth. And many of the Arab writing Africans preserved, like Muhammad Kati was one of them, and Rahman el-Sadi was another. They preserved a lot of those things in books that are in modern translations, like Timbuktu and the Songhai Empire and the Timbuktu Chronicles that were written in the 1500s. Now, after we were brought here, however, they still continue that oral culture. But two things happened in the 1920s and the 30s that helped solidify that. There was a professor at Fisk University named Ophelia Settle, as well as Dr. Charles S. Johnson. They had their students go out in Nashville and take down the stories of a lot of the elderly enslaved people of that region. And at the same time that was happening, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, you had Dr. John Brother Cade, who had his students do the same thing. And so Ophelia Settle's book was called The Unwritten History of Slavery. And Dr. John Brother Cade's book was called, it was an article published in the Journal of Negro History that Carter G. Woodson started called Out of the Mouths of Slaves. And when people saw the richness in the stories of these elderly enslaved people, that's what led to the federal government with the Workers' Progress Administration having the WPA slave narratives that sent writers across the country to preserve the stories and wisdom of these elderly ex-slaves to where you and I can read them and learn about them today. Now, many of these things did not come out before the public up until, like, say, the late 70s, and they used to be very accessible on the internet, and today it's hard to find, but if you know where to look, you can find them. But that's how we can expose the people to these things so that young people can have that connect in a manner that they can understand, so that the young people can relearn that connection with the wisdom of their ancestors, that they could take that knowledge from the past and use it in the present so they can move forward.
Exactly. That's gotta get your cherry. You know what I mean? We're just trying to play a part in that bigger picture that you just described. So let's go to some of our questions and comments that we had. So let's go back to Latasha was asking, what is CRT? I didn't want to forget that one. What is CRT? Critical race theory. Damon, do you want to explain that more?
Yes, I do.
I was reading more actually earlier today. I think at dinner I was reading about it more. Again, I've been reading about it, but go ahead. Okay,
critical CRT. Race theory, in the most simplest terms possible, it means using race to understand how the law works in the United States. It's a practice that's used in the higher level law classes. However, when the description of it, the real description of it came out, the people who were actually using it, their explanation was so wonky and heavy that it took the average person, it was like reading quantum physics or Chinese algebra. So because of that gap in information, that allowed the opposition to use it as a means to gin up votes by presenting it in the way that's manner most offensive to white people as possible, claiming that it was teaching the hatred of white people and the hatred of America and all this nonsense. It's not that. Critical race theory is not actually the teaching of Black history that some of us have been saying. It's not that either. It's simply using using race in a critical means to understand how the law has not always been beneficial to Black people in America. That's CRT.
And what you said, and it's not just about race either. Mm-hmm. It's about gender, race.
It's expanded to that, yes.
Yeah. And it was on a legal theory, critical right. thinking on legal basis in right. law school, very high level, that a political party has politicized in a very negative way to mm-hmm. gain votes and to gin up fear, and it's a cultural war. It's part right. of a cultural war, that they're using to gin up fear. And the consequences of it in a political, societal sense is going to be, and is devastating to who we are as a society. But the theory itself is not societal or political. It's a higher education theory.
Right.
That's what it is. And hopefully people look at our legal system, justice system, in a critical sense,
right.
lens of race and gender, etc. All right, but yeah, critical, and it's very, very in depth. This has been around, I think, 1995. I think.
Correct. Yeah, Dr. Derek Bell. Yeah.
Many books. It's not just one book. There's
Mhm.
many books that inform this theory, just like we've had this discussion today. Yeah, if you're going to study something, use multiple sources, diverse sources. I want to go back to one thing we were talking about too. You were talking about going through school. My first school, I actually came through very integrated system. The only 2 years that I could say I went to segregated schools was at Choppy Middle School in the rural Choppy community of Georgetown County. And that's when we came back. My dad retired from the Air Force and we came back. And my mother was librarian at Choppy. So she took the three youngest kids, because my brother went, instead of coming back home, he went on to college by the time my dad retired. He spent most of his life as a military brat. My dad retired, he went to USC, and the rest of us came back and finished school in Georgetown. And I spent the first 2 years in very segregated circumstances, majority Black schools. And I think the first year there were like 3 white children, 2 twins, there were 2 white males and a white female. She ended up getting pregnant and she dropped out of school. And then the 2 twins, I think, graduated, and I don't even remember their names. And I remember that. Then after that, my final year there, it was totally all Black. The strength of being in that school, all Black school, was very much immersed in Black history. I mean, it was. Because it was an all Black school, so they taught Black history, closed the book, taught history, Black history. But it was also a shock to my system, because prior to that, being in the military, schools were very integrated. And they were integrated in the military. Y'all have to understand that Truman integrated the military. You had to go to
1948.
Yeah, you had to go to integrated schools. The military, especially by the time my generation all came on, they had a system. You would get demerits. Your parents would get demerits if certain things did not happen. The school system, the defense system was very integrated. They forced that integration. And I think that benefits us to this day. One of the things we also did when we went overseas and lived on Guam, when you went overseas, you were assigned a local family. And the local family, and they, the ones we were assigned, they were also in the military, a military father, and stayed friends with them even after we left Guam. But they took us into the local culture, the local communities. We went to weddings, festivals, really got close to the Farillos was the name, to these families. My first language was actually not English nor Gala, because I didn't start speaking until I was 5, and that's a whole nother thing. But I picked up the Guamanian dialect, me and my younger brother. Very integrated. A lot of folks from Japan were on Guam, very integrated. Then when I left middle school, those 2 years, I came back into town, went to Winyah High School, which was a traditionally white school. So even though the schools were integrated, it was about 80% white, 20% Black, and Howard was the opposite, like 80% Black, 20% white. There was integration, but internally it wasn't integrated, But and then I went on to USC, which was a traditionally white school, obviously not majority Black. So my education was very integrated in that sense, with pockets of, within the integration, with pockets of segregation. But I think my greatest years, the strongest years, when Guam gave me a foundation of being very diverse, different languages, different cultures, etc. And it benefits me to this day with the understanding diversity really is our strength. When you take the strengths of all cultures, the knowledge of all cultures, and it really does benefit all of us. But you have to truly be integrated to understand that. And it's more than ironic, the military, which represents imperialism in many ways, was the place where that integration happened. Diversity truly is our strength. And I just wanted to put that out there, because I think it was Miss Sophia who put in, one of her comments was about the school can be integrated, but the people are still separated. That's very true.
It is, but you see, that depends entirely on the leadership.
It does.
Situation, you see, because a lot of times in the South, it was done against the people's will, for the simple fact that many of the teachers had been brainwashed into believing that if the schools were integrated, that there would be mass rapes of white girls and all this and so forth. But even these teachers did not understand that they were manipulated into thinking that, because I was reading William Watts Ball, who was the editor of the Charleston News and Courier till 1951. And he openly stated the fear was that the poor whites of the South would realize their common oppression with the blacks and come together and overthrow the planter class that ruled the South and the descendants of the planter class that continue to rule the South today. So the real program among the masses of white Southerners was the idea of divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. And they never realized that, even up to recent times.
Oh, very much. So in Georgetown next week, Gab News Online, which is our local online newspaper, we're starting Candid Conversations in Black and White. Mm-hmm. And they posted it on their Facebook page coming Wednesday at 12 noon, Candid Conversations in Black and White. And one of the comments was, well, what about poor white people? We're going to address that during Candid Conversations.
Well, for one thing, most white people don't want to admit they're poor to begin with. So
exactly, because their value is their whiteness. And that's what they've been taught. And many of them don't know. And had a conversation recently about that for a program that's coming up. And I'm going to talk about it at the end of the show. About Bacon's Rebellion was about the white landowning male class separating Native Americans, the enslaved Africans, and indentured white people. Because they knew they started miscegenation. They started having sex together. So I just say it. They started communing together, socializing together, having sex together. And they knew they started getting hip to, man, we all oppressed here. So we need to kind of start working together.
Revolution.
Yeah, they start talking revolution. And it was the upper caste that said, oh, we can't have this.
Exactly.
So they had to start talking race. They had to say white is better. You need to value your whiteness because white is better. Lighter skin is better. English is better. So now we're going to take the Native Americans and we're going to assimilate you and beat or take your native languages out of you, your native customs, culture out of you, because white European is better. And the enslaved, well, we wake up most of the time, we still the color we are. It's going to be harder to assimilate. So black had to be bad. Black is not good. Black is violent and all of that. So they started this separation, and it ended up being, and we are taught about Bacon's Rebellion in school, but we're not really taught the real reasons why we had Bacon's Rebellion in school. It's tied into the it's tied into the bigger revolutionary story rather than revolution against upper class white landowning males.
Okay, I want to get back to the questions in just a second, but just very quickly to get back to what you just said. That's why I always teach the importance of understanding that there were revolts against this type of thing, because so many people believe their situation is hopeless. But even back then, you had people who revolted against this, and there were times when they succeeded, as a matter of fact. For example, the best known example of that, of course, being the Haitian Revolution, where they overthrew the French rule in Haiti to make Haiti an independent nation. And even when you talked about Georgetown just now, back when Juan Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon brought these Africans over, they overthrew and killed him before they ran into the forest to blend together with the Native American population. That was also the scene of the first slave rebellion in America. So it's important that these things are taught to the youth that they shouldn't be done. But now I saw Eric had a question just now. What was it?
He had a comment, and it was a good comment. Eric's been on fire today. February 25th is Georgetown's emancipation. Yes, it is. Poor white Southerners must then and now realize that the wages of whiteness, as Du Bois called it, leaves their pockets empty and their cupboards bare.
That's true. But Dr. King said when he spoke in Selma in 1965 that while those things were true, it also psychologically gave them a superiority complex so that they could take comfort in the fact that they weren't at the bottom of the totem pole. Now, what was the one about the anniversary of Georgetown and emancipation?
February 25th, 1863 is when Georgetown was informed that emancipation. Yeah.
We have our Emancipation Day on January 1st, 1863. We knew from day one, and to this day, we celebrate Emancipation Day in Charleston over that.
Yeah, and we celebrated on Watch Night Services Emancipation Day, but many people don't realize our actual day in Georgetown was February 25th. Because of that goes to speaks to communication, methods of communication. You know, it took longer. It wasn't email.
Right. And then too, that's why you have Watch Night in the first place, is because they were waiting on word. They heard that Lincoln was going to sign the proclamation on New Year's, so they stayed up in churches waiting and praying for that to happen on New Year's. And so that's the real story behind how Watch Night started in the first place.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, it's just, I do want to say this because we have about 4 minutes left, so we're going to wrap up here. And this has been a fascinating conversation, and exactly the conversation I wanted to have, because we really do need to understand history as we make these declarations, especially on social media. Social media will quickly drag you into a rabbit hole. But yeah, we've got to make the effort to really get a fuller view of our own history. And I'm talking Black folks too, Black and white folks.
Yes, let me just briefly say, folks, social media is not your best source for history. Understand that. You are better off going into the library and asking your reference librarians for suitable material. Well, yes, that's true that many white teachers, I've had a few that did, in all honesty, but they're relatively few. But I will say this, though, even with that, you don't necessarily have to depend on that. If you are literate, go to your libraries, go to your reference the librarians to ask for suitable books on African-American history. That's the best way to go.
And y'all, and social media is different from reference websites. There are reference legitimate websites on the internet. Social media is TikTok, Facebook,
right.
Reddit, all those other things that people are just making up stuff. But that's why you have to be discerning and go to multiple sources. There are good sources on social media, but you have to be discerning. And if I say it, I'm very comfortable telling you, go look at other sources, because most of the things that I've said, because I've already read it, I've gone to multiple sources.
Exactly. That's called cross-referencing.
Yeah. But
that's
if it's somebody,
cross-referencing.
Exactly.
And plus, Google Scholar is a good way too, because with Google Scholar, you get definitely these multiple sources and such. And okay. Well, look, I'm going to be all around. Okay, I tell you what you do. Sign on to my social media page, Damon L. Fordham, and you'll find out where I'm going to be at various times and so forth. I have a YouTube channel called The American Storyteller, where I do a lot of these things in a storytelling fashion. I've written 3 books, True Stories of Black South Carolina, which you can find in many of your CVS stores, the Voices of Black South Carolina, as well as I've done a novel called Mr. Potts and Me, which is about that storytelling tradition. And I've got a 4th one coming up, talking of a very important story of how the 6 Black leaders fought Ben Tillman to try to stop him from segregating the state. That should be out sometime in the fall. But I'm going to stay in touch with all of you good folks so that we can continue this conversation.
Yeah, because next week, Damon and I are going to be on together on a show, and I have it. Hold on. Brought by the Stone Soup Storytelling Festival out of Spartanburg, and we're going to be it's going to be different because I usually am asking the questions. So this time, I think you and I are going to be the guests, and we're going to get the questions.
Correct.
And just riff off of each other, as Damon and I are want to do. And and this should be very interesting. Please, y'all, come on out, sign up on Eventbrite, conversations celebrating Black history, culture, and community. We're going to go in a different direction with it. So this is going to be good information also. So y'all come on out and enjoy that. Also, you do have to register on Eventbrite. Go to stonesoupsc.org That's stonesoupsc.org, and go to the registration link and get registered for that. And that is next Saturday on the 19th. And we have another conference coming up. Damon, I don't know if you are aware of this, the Gullah Geechee and African Diaspora Conference, February 24th through the 26th at Coastal Carolina University. The 24th through the 25th is presentations. As a matter of fact, the theme this year is ownership. Let me go ahead and put that page up.
I was asked about that, but I'm all booked up.
Yeah, I'm going to be speaking at this one also.
Good.
The theme is Who Owns This? Communities, Heritage, and Preservation. February 24th through 26th, 2022 in Conway, South Carolina, and virtual. And on the 26th, Saturday 26th, they have Gullah Geechee Community Day in downtown Conway. Vendors, music. It's more cultural, where you could just go in and get engaged in the culture. But the presentations at the conference, the theme this year is Who Owns This? Communities, Heritage, and Preservation. And as the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce, I have been a huge proponent of ownership, because it goes back to what you were talking about, creating that labor class.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't about having ownership. It was about creating a labor class to serve the owners.
Correct.
And in many ways, that's why we have been left out of the billions generated by the tourism industry. Any ecosystem, if you want to be a part of it, you need to own something. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that we own that no one else owns is the Gullah Geechee culture. No one else has ownership of that. The chamber, that's a whole nother conversation. That's why y'all need to come to my presentation. I'm not going to tell y'all now. I'm not going to tell you now. But if you can make this conference, go ahead to the Coastal Carolina University website and get registered for that. And also for the stonesoupsc.org. Damon and I will be on next Saturday in that conversation also. Damon, anything else we need to know? Thank you for putting up your book titles. I am looking forward to your new book.
Okay, well, I'm always looking forward to bring this information out there, because, you know, I look at it like this. When I was young, I soaked it up from the wise elders as well as through books. So many young people are not exposed to either one. I have a duty to bring that to them, so that when the day comes that our generation passes away, this type of knowledge will still go on for a better future.
Isn't that the truth? And you know something? That's the best way to end today's show. Thank you, Damon, for coming on. As always, you know, when the book is out, I want you back on here so we can talk about the book and tell people buy the book. I could say that. He says it too, but I could say it, because we need to support our authors. We really do, who are giving us knowledge. We need to support those authors. Damon, thank you for joining me today. As always. It's been very pleasurable. I'm going to let you go, and we'll be talking definitely next Saturday.
Will do.
All right. See you later. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for Black History Month with Damon Fordham. As always, bringing us knowledge. Eric Grant, you were on fire today. Thank you for your comments. P. Laura, Latasha, Sophia, thank you for your comments, and others. If I missed you, I apologize. But thank you for joining us today on a gathering place, as we brought in Professor Damon Fordham. It is always enjoyable to have him. And this Wednesday coming up, we have actually Coastal Carolina University will be joining us to talk about the upcoming conference and everything that's involved with that, because we want you to know a little bit more. So every Wednesday and Sunday at 4:00, we bring you a gathering place. And this Wednesday, February 16th, we will have Coastal Carolina University, the Charles Joyner Gullah Institute on to talk about the upcoming conference. And of course, everybody, happy Valentine's Day. Enjoy Valentine's Day. And if you don't have somebody to love you, love yourself. Because that's what I do. I'm going to go buy me some flowers and chocolate and eat it all up. All right, y'all. Always enjoy. Thank you for joining us today. Y'all have a good one, and we'll see you Wednesday at 4:00. Good night.